So let's talk about organisms that are sometimes referred to as foundation species. These are organisms that play important roles in creating and defining a community. Oftentimes they modify the environment and help it to be more able to support other organisms. A good example of a foundation species are kelp. So kelp are these brown algae that essentially form almost like underwater forest in the oceans off the coast of California. So these forests then become the homes of all kinds of organisms, things like seals, all kinds of fish. So they form the foundation of the community. Coral is another good example of a foundation species. The reefs that are made by the coral form essentially an environment that all kinds of other fish, crustaceans, sea anemones, all kinds of things live in that area that was created essentially by the coral. Let's don't confuse foundation species with keystone species. A keystone species is one that has a disproportionately large effect on the community structure relative to its biomass or abundance. Keystone species usually belong to higher trophic levels. They're usually some type of predator, and they can act in a lot of diverse ways. A really famous example of a keystone species is a specific sea star found in the intertidal waterways in the northwestern U.S. So there's a famous experiment where the sea stars were removed from the intertidal zone. So they were completely taken out of their environment. When they came out, the populations of their prey, which were the mussels, exploded. They went essentially through exponential growth. But what that ended up doing is that altered the different species that were found in that community. But while the sea stars were there were about over 2,500 species of barnacles and algae that lived in these little intertidal zones. But once the sea stars were removed, the mussel population expanded so dramatically that almost all of those barnacles and algae went extinct because essentially the mussels pushed them out or fed on them. So this sharp reduction in diversity oftentimes happens when a keystone species is removed from the environment. Another really important keystone species that you'll hear a lot about is the shark. Here we can see an example. So sharks feed on these rays. The rays feed on these bivalves and arthropods. When the sharks are removed, the rays, their population increases dramatically. Now there's so many of those that they end up killing off lots of the crustaceans, lots of the bivalves, lots of the arthropods, and the populations collapse. And eventually, that's going to probably also kill out their rays in the long run. It's called a keystone species. A keystone is the stone at the top of an arch that essentially holds the arch together. So if that keystone is removed, the arch falls. If a keystone species is removed from a food chain or an environment, it falls. It falls apart. Let's also talk about invasive species. So these are species that are introduced to an area outside of where they normally are found, their native range. Oftentimes, because there's no natural predators for these invasive species there, they outcompete and they out-reproduce the native species, and they can cause the population size of native species to drop or even sometimes go extinct. One of the most famous examples of an invasive species is kudzu. So this was an ornamental type of vine plant brought in from Asia. And it grew, and now it's taken over large parts of the South. Asian carp were introduced into U.S. waterways to get rid of algae, but they reproduce so fast that now up to 95% of the biomass in some U.S. waterways is made up of these Asian carp. They've pushed everything else essentially near extinction in those waterways. Some other famous examples are the pythons that have been introduced into the Everglades and are competing with alligators and pushing their numbers down. The snakehead fish, which has become a huge problem in Florida. And even things like the rabbit, which were introduced to Australia and competed with the kangaroo and caused some massive problems there as well.